Hello everyone, it is Caitlin, and today I'm going to teach you all about piping mid-19th century dresses. So piping is an interesting technique that you see on almost every single extant garment from the time period I studied, which is 1830 to 1870. You also see it prior to 1830 and after 1870, but that's the time period I study and you do see it almost always. And it's a feature that those who reproduce historical clothing often miss or do incorrectly. Piping is most used to finish the edge of garments and also to strengthen seams. But the most common places you will see piping are the neckline, right here, the waistline, and also the armscye, which is just the fancy term for armhole. Out of the three, armscye piping is the most common, so even dresses that don't have piping at the waistline or the neckline will still have it at the armscye. It is very, very rare, vanishingly rare, to find a garment with no piping. Now let's look at some ways that people who reproduce historical clothing often mess up on piping. The first mistake I see is to not use piping at all. Offhand, I've only studied one original piece that did not have piping, and I only know of about 4 others that did not feature any piping whatsoever. And I've looked at a lot of extant dresses. So unless you are reproducing an exact dress that did not have piping, and one could argue that you still need to document and be the person who wore that dress in the area they wore and that sort of thing, just to document that, to truly be correct wearing that sort of unusual piece, it is best practice to add piping to your reproduction gowns. The second mistake I see most often is using contrast piping, so piping that does not match the garment itself. Piping is nearly always the same as the dress fabric, meaning it's made from the same material. Now I did say almost always because there are extant examples of contrast piping. I have seen 4 adult dresses from this time period with contrast piping, most notably the Mary Todd Lincoln silk velvet gown with silk satin piping. This particular dress uses the piping more as trim as opposed to the actual functional piping you see in most dresses. 3 of the extant gowns that I know of that have contrast piping have been silk gowns. One is either a wool or linen. I'm leaning more towards wool. The person who says it has it says it's linen. So somewhere in there. It was trimmed all in braid work, and the piping specifically matched the braid work. It looked just like braid work around the armscye and the waistline as well. So that may have been why contrast piping was used there. Now you may notice I reference adult dresses. Because you do see contrast piping more often in children's dresses than you do in adult clothing. But the bottom line is that almost all piping is of the dress fabric. The third mistake I see people doing is using piping that is far too big. I made this mistake a lot when I first started doing living history. Actually, until I started collecting antique clothing and truly realized how tiny this piping cord should be. Personally, I use size 8 or size 10 cotton pearl for my piping because on my extant dresses that most closely resembles the original piping that I have. And I do have some dresses that the piping has, the silk has worn away, so you can see the actual piping cord. And I've noticed that in size 8 and size 10 cotton pearl seems to replicate it very, very closely. The final mistake that I see most often is to use a store-bought piping. So no, you cannot go to Joann's and buy their pre-packaged piping. One, because it's not going to match your dress fabric, and we already discussed contrast piping. 2, because it's going to be far too big. Store-bought piping is often even bigger than the yarn that I was using beforehand. And store-bought piping is often made of polycotton, which is just not a correct fabric to begin with. So there's that. I promise you that piping does not require any special skills or tools, and I'm going to show you how to do it in this video, so just skip the store-bought piping. Now let's move on to a piping myth. And listen closely because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. It does not require extra yardage to cut piping. I most often see this as an excuse to not add piping to a garment. Things like, I don't have enough fabric to make piping, or I can't afford more of this fabric to make piping, or even, it just wastes too much fabric. No, it does not. You can cut piping from literal scraps of fabric. I made a dress where I had to physically piece most of the bodice and the waistband with an inch of its life, and I still managed to scrounge up enough tiny little pieces to make piping. So unless you are dealing with literal threads of fabric being left over, like you can literally cut everything down and there's pieces that are maybe this big, maybe that long, and that's all you have left, you have enough to make piping, I promise. Most of the time I use the scrap that is left over from cutting the bodice to make my piping. I don't add any extra fabric to make the piping. It really does not require as much yardage as you would think. I will say, as you begin, it is harder to cut piping out of scraps because you do have to cut it on the bias, and it's sometimes hard to find the bias unless you're on a true straight edge, but it can be done, and I've done it many times. So if you are working with literal scraps, it still can be done. With all that being said, let's take a break and go look at some original dresses and how they pipe their bodices. One of the originals in my personal collection. It dates to the 1860s. I actually just got this in the mail today, and since I was already out oogling it, I figured we could talk about some piping. So you can see the piping is in the same fabric as we discussed, and you can see it here at the neckline, that little line here, armscyes, and also the waistline. So at the neckline and waistline, it is used to finish off these edges, so you have a nice, clean, stable line, both here at the neckline and also on the waistline. And yes, this bodice does have 3 darts, which is why I bought it. That and the fact it was $20. And here's her armscye piping, which is not used to finish off an edge, but rather just to stabilize that seam. And you can see she left it raw on the inside. That is another mistake that I see a lot of people making in reproduction clothing, which is we tend to finish our edges far too much. The Victorians were not nearly so picky. If it didn't get seen, it didn't get covered, unless it was going to like ravel significantly, and then they worried about it. But most of the time they didn't bother. Here's another one of my originals, also from the 1860s. Now this one is slightly later 1860s, and so she chose not to pipe her neckline. She bound those instead. But still, she has piping here. And this is a silk 1850s dress piped at the armscye, waistline, and neckline. This one has a waistband, so it has piping at the bottom of the waistband, but it does not have it at the top of the waistband. You do see originals that are piped both at the top and the bottom, so that's totally personal preference, but you will almost always see it on the bottom in this type of construction. Alright, just one more original, I promise. So I wanted to show this bodice because there's a section where the silk has worn away, and you can see the actual piping cord. Can you see how small it is? Look how tiny that little thing is. There's my finger, and that's how tiny the piping is. Most often you'll see white or natural colored cotton cording being used as piping. So let's do a quick size comparison. Here is the sugar and cream yarn that I used to use for piping. Can you see how much larger that is? This sugar and cream piping is actually less than half the size of store-bought piping too, so let that sink in a little bit. And you can see that it's still far too big to compare to the original. Next up we have some size 30 cotton pearl, and you can see that's a bit too small. It's not quite the size of the original. Now let's look at my size 8 cotton pearl. It's nearly exactly the same size as the original. This is a very good material to use for cording. I've also seen people use the size 10, which is just slightly smaller, but it still looks very nice. I think both size 8 and size 10 cotton pearl are acceptable in reproduction dresses. Let's do a quick size comparison. This is one of my reproduction dresses. This is a sheer wool dress, and I used the sugar and cream yarn because this is before I knew better. And you can see how much bigger the piping is here than it is on the original, so this is not an acceptable piping material anymore. And here's a size 8 cotton pearl. So just for reference, this is the original and this is the reproduction. This is the reproduction of this original dress. So they're nearly exactly the same. But you can see how much closer the size is with the size 8 cotton pearl to the original. Okay, so now that we have our supplies, pearl cotton in size 8 or 10, and also our dress fabric, even if it scraps, let's get to work making some piping. So we're here with the Paisley 1850s dress, making some piping. And this is kind of how I cut piping. So what I did is I took some scrap fabric. This is just what I had left over after I cut out my skirt pieces, all my bodice pieces, my sleeves, all that. I made a little square, so I took a straight edge like this, and I kind of folded it over, cut down this center line, and that kind of gave me the bias. And so what I'm going to do now is use my lovely little straight edge. This is how I cut piping. You can cut it with scissors, it's fine. I just find this faster. And I like to cut my piping about 1.5 inches. And just use your rotary cutter. makes it really easy. Now I need new rotary cutter blades. In theory, this should all just cut. And now I have these straight bits. They have corners like this, that's fine. And I have 2 pieces right now, so I'm going to keep going. And for this particular gown, I'm hoping for a lot of piping. So we're going to see how much I can get from this. So we're going to work on another dress real quick. This is some silk taffeta for an 1830s dress, and we're going to pipe basically all the seams in this gown, so we're going to need a whole lot of piping. But I wanted to show you this one before I showed you the paisley dress, just so I can give you a little bit more detail. Since I hand sew my 1830 stuff, you're going to see a little bit more. So I have my general 1 1/4 inch wide bias, and I have my other pieces. So when you're sewing them together, it makes sense to put them like this, where they match up, but that doesn't work because you get a right angle. So what you want to do is make it opposite. So the points point away from one another. And you take your thread, and if you're doing later stuff than like 1830s, then you can probably do this by machine. But I'm just going to run it up basically to where the points meet. So like where this kind of comes into dip, and I'm going to start at the same dip on the other side. And when I hand stitch this, I usually just use a running stitch. I actually have not picked apart original to see if they did it with a running stitch or with a back stitch, but running stitches hold it just fine, and I've never known the Victorians to overdo anything. So if something works, they will usually just do the bare minimum. And so then you see we have a nice seam. So I'm going to take this side now, and we're going to do the same thing with another piece. Putting it together where the points are pointing away from one another. And start in the dip. Run the seam up to the other dip. And then tie it off. By which I usually just go back a few times. And we're going to keep doing that until all of our bias is exhausted. And we have enough for piping, at which point we're going to press these seams. I like to press mine open so it's not too bulky on one side. So I just have my regular foot in right now. And again, just like last time, we're not going to match these two together because that gives us an angle. We're going to match the pointy parts away from each other and sew in the ditch where they meet, just all the way down. Just like that. And sometimes without even taking it out, I'll just sew in the next one. Like this. So now that we have our bias cut out, we are ready to make our piping. So I have already cut a length of piping. I go ahead and cut them off straight like this. It doesn't really matter. I just prefer to work with it on the straight like this. So I go ahead and cut off the long pointy end, and I just cut it off straight here. And we have our lovely bias, and I also have, of course, our size 8 cotton pearl. I will show you how to machine sew piping in a little bit. But I'm just going to sandwich it right in the middle. So there's my fabric, and then there's my piping in the center, and there's my other piece of fabric. And I'm going to do my sewing in rather large stitches. It doesn't have to be nice and neat. I just want to keep that cording right at the edge. And I'm sewing right directly where the piping or the cording ends. And I'm going to do this all the way down. And here we come to a seam here in just a second, and we're going to do the same thing. It can get a little bit difficult to feel for the piping when it's on a seam like this. Now to attach it to the armscye. So I have here my fabric, the dress really, and so this is the neckline. I have these lovely little Van Dyke edges, but then here's my actual armhole. I'm going to take my piping and I'm going to fold in the edge. I don't want to fold it up too much. I kind of want to fold it to where this end right here is kind of where that seam is. Just like that. And I'm going to put it on the edge, put it in. And we're going to go around the whole armscye. I'm just matching up the raw edges. All the way to the end. And I'll just fold under the excess to make these meet. Just like that. Make sure that end is under. So usually I'll do this by hand, and I just do a basting stitch right where the other seam was. Basting means I'm not doing really nice stitches, I'm just tacking it on. And I do this before putting on the sleeve, mainly for one reason. If I were to put the sleeve on now, my piping would be sandwiched, and I'd have to really use my fingers to figure out where that piping was. Now that I'm sewing it, I have a nice little line. I can put the sleeve in there, and I can sew from this side and know exactly where my piping ends. Because you want the piping to look fairly even. You don't want a space where you see a whole lot of the piping and spaces where you see none. You just want to make sure it's really nice and even. And doing this basting stitch helps out. I really do suggest doing all the sleeve sewing by hand, simply because machine sewing gets very bulky very quickly, and when you have a lot of seams in there, it's just going to make your armscye stand out oddly. And on the originals I have seen, even the machine sewn dresses do their piping, do their sleeves by hand. So it's an authentic thing to do. It doesn't take an awful lot of time, and it's just something to get in the good habit of doing. And there we are, armscye piping. I am ready to put in my sleeve, and that can be set. So here's what it looks like when the sleeve is set in. So we have our nice little small piping that is much closer to the originals than what we saw with the larger piping cord. And yeah, it's that easy to set in piping. So as I mentioned before, when I hand stitch garments, I don't like to have to cut down the top half of the piping for things like necklines and waistlines. So what I'll do instead is actually just fold under a quarter bit here and sew the piping in that way. That way I don't have to cut anything out. So you're doing it just the same as before, you're just not folding the piping in half. And we're going to just do our little basting stitches. This often works really well if you cut the piping a little narrower to begin with before you seam it together. So you can see I now have a length of piping that looks just like we cut it, even though we didn't. Alright, so we have our finished piping here, which is an edge piping. And I have the bodice that's going to go on right here. So here's the waistline here. And I'm just going to fold this edge back just slightly, and I'm going to put it on the edge of the bodice. And you want the nice clean edge of piping facing up towards you. And as for darts, when you get to darts, all the originals I have seen had the darts facing towards the back. So when you look over here, you don't want them flipped to the front, you want them flipped to the back. Now we get to sew it in. And if you're doing a 1850s, 1860s dress, you are more than welcome to machine stitch this. I have ones that are machine stitched. This is an 1830s dress, so we're hand doing it. And the one dress, it's not 1830s, it's 1860s. But the one that was hand sewn still, that I could tell, they did a running stitch. So super easy. So again, we're going to sew it on that line we did before. This time, however, we want to make sure we're doing pretty small stitches, because this is the only time we're going to do the seam. We're not going to come redo it and put anything on top. Alright, so once that was done, what I did is I just took the piping that was like this, and I folded the raw edges in, and I ironed it. You don't actually have to iron it. You can finger press it and then sew it. And now we're going to stitch this up. So I'm going to take, and this is something, even if you're doing a piece by machine, this is something you need to do by hand, because you don't want your stitches seen from the front. So I'm only going through the lining layers, and I'm whipping this on. And it's okay if there's like 1 or 2 stitches that you go over to the fashion fabric as well. I've seen that in originals. It's just they tried to hide it. And that is the one reason you can't do this by machine, because machines can't go just through 1 layer. And you can see that my piping isn't very even at all. It's kind of thicker here and thinner here. It's fine if it's even. I've seen both on originals. I have one original that is just very tiny, and then other places it's huge. So I don't particularly worry about getting it right. It's on the inside. The Victorians didn't seem to really care, or at least the early Victorians didn't really seem to care what the insides of their dresses looked like. Alright, so we're ready to work on the piping, sewing this together. So last time we made 2 different kinds of piping. We did one that we folded just a little bit over and one that we folded all the way in half. This time, this is what I usually do for machine sewn piping. I'm going to sew all of it halfway, and then we'll cut the top part off of the parts that we want to do for the neckline and waistline. So for machine made piping, your zipper foot's going to be your best friend, because this edge here is going to keep that piping where it needs to be. So I have my cord here. We're going to get it started. Set it in. And this edge is really keeping that piping in its place. So all you're going to do is kind of feel for it, make sure it's kind of in the same spot, and the piping foot will do the rest. Every once in a while you want to check it, make sure your cording's all the way in the center, fold it over, feel for it, and then go. So now we have our length of piping, and I've already taken a little bit off and used it as is to pipe the armscyes here on my gown. So the rest of this needs to be the type of piping that we use to bind. So I'm just going to take my scissors and cut just the top layer. Not cutting extremely close to the seam, but you know, on the seam side, closer to the seam than to like the raw edge. So now let's talk a little bit about how to bind a neckline, which is basically exactly the same as how to bind a waistline. And from the back, I am leaving some of this piping over instead of matching this with the edge. That's just how my seam allowance is set up. If you need a bigger seam allowance, you can always match it. Alright, so we have talked about how to make piping, but I know some of you are thinking, I don't have the yardage for piping. That is not true. You can always find fabric for piping. I really can't imagine a situation where you wouldn't, unless you had an already extremely narrow skirt and no extra fabric. But this is what I have left from the brown silk. I thought I had cut enough piping, and I had cut enough piping. I just forgot that I also had to bind the edges of the pelerine. So I need about 100 inches of piping, and all I have is tiny little scraps. We are going to get 100 inches of piping from this. Easily, I would think. We're going to see. So what I'm going to start by doing is taking the pieces that are already on the bias and cutting those first, because those are the easiest things. I'm going to cut mine that. If you absolutely have no fabric that's left over from your project, or you bought it off somebody and it didn't have piping, whatever your situation is, you can always take a 2-inch strip out of the skirt and use that as piping. You just have a seam every 2 inches, which is perfectly fine. This is fun. This is a nice big piece. I have to cut this to make it angled. Okay. Of course, remember, it doesn't matter if piping, that's my bias, if you happen to have a piece of piping with a design, it doesn't matter if it necessarily matches. It's so tiny that usually you wouldn't notice if it didn't match. Alright, let me lay this out and see what I have so far. Alright, so that in and of itself was almost a yard of piping, just those little tiny pieces. So like here it is. You can kind of see it over there. And I just overlapped it so you could, there's already a seam allowance there. I did have this left over, so this is about the same amount. A little less, it's about 28 inches. So already I'm almost halfway there. So I'm going to keep cutting some piping. And then of course I get to stitch all these tiny little pieces together, which is so much fun. Alright, here we are. I got 108 inches of bias, and this is all I have left. It really is just scraps now, tiny little pieces. Not a particular use. I don't think I can get really much more out of it. Maybe out of like this piece or something. It'd be like 1 inch bias strips. I could probably get a couple more inches out of this. But all I needed was about 100, and I got about 108. So yeah, even if you're working on scraps, you can still get bias. Just do the best you can. Pick the pieces that are already on the bias or close to the bias. Straighten that bias up. Start cutting. This particular piece, like this is on the straight grain. You just have to find the bias and cut strips. They'd be quite tiny, but it is doable. If you have absolutely no fabric left, again, you can just cut a 2-inch strip from one of the skirt panels and use that as your piping. So it really does not require any extra yardage. You can use just scraps to make your piping. This was even just scraps from scraps, so I already pieced other pieces in this gown, and whatever left over I made more bias. Hopefully that was a little bit of encouragement to you that yes, you can get piping from scraps. So hopefully that was an encouragement for some of you, and you got some ideas if you have a gown that doesn't have piping on how to add some with either scraps or, a skirt, a little bit out of the skirt or something like that. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about piping. I hope you found the video both informative and interesting, and I hope you enjoyed the original pretties. As always, have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time.